hi everyone. It seems a bit awkward to be like just. You seem very pretty. Everyone seems pretty high. But anyway, we are very comfortable, so that's kind of an advantage. Before everything, I wanted to thank Vanessa for this very kind introduction, and I wanted to thank Barbara for being here with me to speak about Hans Hartung and this kind of rediscovery project that we are all excited about. I see many people here that are involved too, so I'm very happy to see you guys around. Maybe we thought with Barbara that the best way maybe to start this very informal conversation. This is not an academic lecture. We wanted it to be quite lively, and I thought that the best start would be to ask Barbara how you met the work of Hans Hartung, in which conditions, and how come this work became singular and of interest for you. I guess that was an interesting story for me, but I think people would like to hear it.
Well, thank you.
You're
yes. Welcome. It was, I thought this was sort of a thrilling opportunity because it was kind of a nostalgia thing for me. We discovered Hartung really in the mid-70s in the Lefebvre Gallery, and we became very interested in his work and also in the Cobra artists and people surrounding him. So that was mainly how I came upon it, and then he fits into sort of work that interests me always, which is, it's somewhere between drawing and painting, and it's kind of ephemeral in certain ways, and yet at the same time it's very strict. So I found that especially interesting, and I'm very glad to see it again.
Good, good.
And you? How did you?
Basically I was born in 1976, so it took me quite a while to get interested. But as a matter of fact, I did my master thesis a long time ago on Abex, and of course I had to see over a few biographies, and Hartung was a very interesting one, but at the same time my attention was more on people like Rothko, Pollock of course, and some other more forgotten painters like Canadian painters of Le Refus Global. Think about Riopel, Borduas, like many names that are pretty unknown right now. And I thought Hartung was kind of too obvious, and maybe I misread the work. Like everyone, I was just seeing works from the post-war period, which were interesting, but kind of they all did not that good. And to be honest, I stayed on this aspect. It was a long time ago. Many years after that, many years after my PhD thesis, I just left my position at the Sorbonne as an assistant professor to go in a center called the Deutsches Forum für Kunstgeschichte, which is basically the German Villa Medici, and it happens to be in Paris. So I was a research fellow there, and they told me, you are a contemporary art historian, you have to go to the Hartung Foundation, the Hartung Bergman Foundation in the south of France, in Antibes. How come you've never been there? I said, okay, I'm gonna go there. But I wasn't excited. I was flattered. It's a great, Hartung was something in the history of art for everyone, but it wasn't thrilling. There was no rediscovery possible for me. It was just, okay, let's see the old master's house and see what it gives. And then when I got there, I was really taken in good hands, as we say, by the last assistant of the master, Jean-Luc Hureau, who is here, and Bernard Derderian, who is there too. They basically took me into the sacred space, like in a church, the core. And so I got the amazing opportunity to see the paintings, all the periods, and it was a huge shock actually. I realized how wrong I was on my opinion on the artist, and it really started here. So I wanted to invite him in a few exhibitions. He didn't went, you know, because of organization, because I changed my mind. But we wanted to do something together. So basically, that's you know, how it started, and it's, you know, nice story.
It's a nice story.
For me, at least.
Well, I came in at it from the small things, mainly, you know, from drawings and prints and things like that, and the sort of close readings things, and seeing all these paintings here. I mean, you can see where it comes from, that, but it was astounding to me, and seeing all the color, and what also interests me is how much he sort of evokes other artists before and after. So you see in the late works, someone like Via Selman in the spray painted works, and the celestial sort of feeling of them, even though they come from a very different, you know, point. And then you look back and you see Sam Francis and people like that, and yet he maintains his individuality throughout it all. But that's what, I mean, it interested me how he goes all these different ways, and yet he's a very distinctive artist of a specific period, with a strong core, a kind of strict structure that sort of belies, you know, the ebullient abstraction that you expect.
So could you tell a bit more words for our friends on the tension between this kind of wilderness state,
the
doesn't
wildness,
make sense, wildness, and the very temper, moderated control aspect of his works, especially in drawings, because I was interested in the drawings, but to be honest, this is the missing part of this show. I had to make some choices, and I preferred showing the final works, the paintings, and then let's say not as important categories as photographs or etchings, but there is of course the in-between category, which is the drawing part, but maybe it's an occasion to say a few words on this.
Well, I suppose one thinks when you look at many of those drawings, you think of Paul Klee, you know, and you think of his prints, and they're very, it's kind of, they describe psychological states too, I think. There's a kind of, you know, intensity and a kind of analysis, self-analysis that goes into the way it's shaped. And yet the strict structure, which you don't expect, just makes it interesting. I don't know what to say about that.
There is an interesting, that's an interesting aspect, because beneath every composition and Hartung, where even if it looks like totally chaotic, there is a kind of a secret order. He was fascinated mostly in the 1920s. Then he gave up by the golden section, and he's been doing extensive researches on the golden section, which is kind of a, you know, it's like reporting, you know, works on paper to canvases, as it did. It sounds like something from the Renaissance, actually, the golden section, everything. But even at the late 19th century and early 20th century, many artists were still evolving in that thing. But it kind of went totally abandoned, let's say after Mondrian, sort of, which was finding something else, actually. The 1950s are the great years where the golden section is kind of outcast of contemporary painting. But he did extensive, you know, because he tried to find the, let's say, the logic of beauty, of visual beauty. And he did so many fascinating studies. The foundation in the south of France that is keeping extensive record of his life, of course, except the war years that have been really problematic for his career, because he lost so many things. But except this very moment, which the archives are a bit sparse, you have amazing things, including a few drawings you know, when you really feel the geometry, but it's really complex. It's not just a few lines to see the clarity of the golden section. It's really complex. I mean, it's interlaced. It goes in every direction. You have so many lines. It becomes so complex, and it basically you have the seeds of what was to come, and it's really drawing. Actually, the graphic aspect of his work might be of some interest for you. I mean, the link with many people say it's about ideograms from, you know, Asia, but he always say like, yeah, no, this is different. It has similarities, but I didn't look closely at Asian ideograms to do my paintings and my drawings and my etchings. So maybe in terms of drawing, what could it bring to you?
Well, just incising the paper, I mean, basically, so it's very direct from brain to hand to paper, and I think it's very forceful. So it's just showing his ideas that way, you know. I think what's sort of interesting too is how he related to the other artists then, you know, someone like Pollock, someone like Twombly, or some. So you have a very distinctive style within that whole conversation, and also how he relates to the Cobra artists. But they're much more spontaneous, I think. They're consistently more spontaneous, and they're more interested in the art brew, more. But that's, I mean, I think of him that way.
It's pretty interesting to see. I think it's a constant of the whole work, actually. I've given the title of the exhibition on this basis of not only a contrast, a dialectic, but an oxymoron, basically, between two notions that are opposite.
Yeah.
To make it simple, chaos and order. And how all his life you couldn't see any painting, any work on paper, any etching, even photograph, without thinking of an order behind, actually, hidden order, actually. It was funny, it's funny to see when he was working, most of the time it was at night, very late, with loud music, mostly Bach, as I've heard from my friends at the foundation, and he was working pretty late, and in the morning, with clear ideas, he was basically rearranging stuff. So you have different steps. You have very organized brain, you have, according to me and many commentators, like a very strong character. I mean, a guy who is basically very physical, and of course, he was pretty much diminished after World War II, where he lost a leg on the battlefield, fighting with the Allied side against the Nazis. So basically,
and saving him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he was saving soldiers, actually. He was, you know, he was touched by when he was carrying a hurt soldier, actually, on a carriage thing. So when he went back, he was pretty much diminished physically, and all his energy that you can feel when you read his autobiography called Self-Portrait, Autoportrait. You can feel it because he liked to swim. He went swimming at night in the sea, almost got drowned like 2 times. He was very extreme, climbing mountains, you know, like very extreme experience with his own body, meeting the strength of the elements, the waves, the weather, the wind, everything is very, and when he lost his leg, actually, it became really handicapped. And sometimes I have the feeling that there is a kind of a transcription of all this frustrated energy on the canvas. I mean, it would be hard not to see the work on this.
Well, you actually do have, when you think of all the lines, the furious lines, and in those, you really see the turbulence underneath, even though that's a very formal structure for it.
Turbulence, yeah. That's a good
I think that's... and he was kind of angry, wasn't he?
Apparently, he was not an angry person. Haven't had the chance to meet him, of course, but apparently he was more like a very strong character, actually, but no, apparently no, he was not. He was not like a romantic figure as Pollock, you know, getting drink, you know, getting into fights. It was not that much actually, but he was pretty strong character, that's for sure. Pretty convinced that he was on the right way. But you need that when you're an artist, you know.
I mean, it's sort of interesting considering too his style in relation to some of the, you know, someone like Gorky or someone and the kind of wild canvases, and yet his, I don't know where I'm going with this exactly, but there was a, I mean, somehow that came to mind, but his are so much more controlled, but there were those forms out there sort of fighting.
Yeah, it doesn't look controlled, but it is. But it's interesting that you mentioned Gorky, because Gorky is one of the examples that are regularly quoted in the articles on Hartung to show that many American artists from the School of New York were surrealist before being abstract and called abstract expressionist. And basically they were like surrealist related until the early 40s, since Hartung was purely abstract since almost 20 years actually, with the, as you might have seen, the first, one of the first watercolor that I've included in at the beginning of the exhibition. There is all this here actually. You have the liquid quality, you have the absence of subject, you can't recognize anything. It's just forms that are basically floating on the surface of the paper. So he never had this surrealist phase. So that's how, because always scholars try to compare, and I do too, you do too, European school to American school, but this is a major difference.
That's what I was going to ask you about.
They didn't really go through surrealism in Europe, and Hartung didn't as well.
But he began purely as an abstractionist, which is unusual, right? I mean, he didn't begin with figurative drawing. He didn't strip down.
Exactly.
He started right in the middle.
He had an intuition. Yeah.
And that made it kind of interesting. I mean, you don't sort of look for the figure in his work. That's what distinguishes him from a lot of American abstractionists, I think, of that time.
And you know, it distinguishes him from many artists, before and after. All the names I've been quoting of the artists who invented basically the first line of abstract art around 1912 were figurative before. And then they kind of, as you say, they stripped the subject. But also after Hartung, you know, for example, I remember noticing at the time that Yves Klein was immediately abstract. He was the son of Marie Raymond, who was already a well-known abstract painter. Yeah. So, but I mean, 30 years after Hartung. So Hartung had kind of an intuition, and what is very interesting is that he had no idea about abstract art, as he said. When he was 18 years old, he's been studying old masters and trying to get the what was the better of the form out of the subject, seeing shadow, seeing blurry forms out of figurative painting. He kind of did the stripping, but out of other classical artists.
Right.
So yeah, that's surprising. Oh, not to mention, he kept doing a few works that are figurative. You can find portraits, you can find landscapes. Throughout the 20s, there are still many, not that many paintings, but many works on paper from this period that are, he didn't give up on representation, but his main goal, he was more destructive. The main goal was really abstract art, and this on a very early basis. His most interesting, so it was not like he didn't refuse, And every abstract artist I know is still painting objects that you can recognize. I mean, it's not a religion, you know. I mean, it's not a rupture total with representation, of course. But the main core of the work is definitely non-figurative and hence abstract. So maybe you could. I'd like to hear more, maybe about the 1975. Maybe how was the exhibition at Lefebvre? Lefebvre.
You know, I don't remember everything in this show.
But what's the global thing? Yeah, I know.
But it was a sort of the, you know, mainly the drawing quality and the you know, expressiveness of the drawings and the. You know, I really don't. I mean, I know. I was very impressed with it, but I can't remember everything that was in it to tell you about it. I don't.
No, don't worry. No. But it's interesting to put maybe this exhibition, as I've seen, that was pretty complete in terms of history. There was a pretty wide spectrum of years and decades works.
Yes, but mostly small works.
Mostly small works.
You know, so. And wasn't that at the same time that the Met was having the show of big paintings, new paintings.
And very recent ones.
Yeah, and that Hilton Kramer damned, didn't he?
Yeah.
He's in the Times. So yes, that was kind of strange, and that hurt his reputation a lot.
Of course, yeah. Maybe you can say a few words about the context of the exhibition.
Well, just that it hurt his reputation because that was just the only concept people had of him. It was new work. They didn't know his work in general. They didn't know who he was. So then when they read that, they just didn't know where to plug into understanding him. They weren't interested to begin with. And then Hilton Kramer certainly was kind of controversial figure himself. And it was really rather unfortunate. And the Lefebvres basically were very solid, and they had they had an academic interest in everything too, and they were very conscientious that way. I don't know. So I mean, I think that would have been the real show, and the show at the Met was a sidebar. But as great as these paintings are, it really doesn't tell you the heart of it, I think.
Yeah, that was a complex, it's very important actually if we want to look at Hartung today to consider this episode, because it had a tremendous impact on the rest of the career worldwide, so sort of. He was he was in every major American museum, in every major collection, and this exhibition at the Met should have been like consecration, I mean?
Yeah.
And a lot of honor, and it didn't go that way actually, because my opinion is that he chose with Henri Getzaler, who was the curator of the show, he chose to exhibit only very recent, as you said, large, pretty pop paintings actually. Some of them you can see at NAMAD Contemporary right now. I didn't include so much of this period because I'm not that fond of them, but they are interesting actually. They are very strange, bright colors, pretty, I don't know. It was a different discourse.
With a pop mentality.
Yeah, that was a strange period in his own career. These are very bizarre paintings in his own career. So I was so risky to show only this short time frame and this short aesthetic actually, and making people believe, the great audience of course, but some art critics like Kramer who were already, like, as you said,
predisposed.
Yeah, but the problem is that he published his article and it took 2 weeks, which is a long time, for other really nice articles by other critics that were really laudative. They were really acknowledging the artist, not the last works, but the whole career. And Getzaler said, yeah, but in the catalog you have a whole spectrum of history, but you know, it was only in the catalogue. The exhibition must have told a longer story.
Why do you think he would have done that, though? Why would he have chosen that?
There are plenty of reasons, actually. For me, the most acceptable reason is artists, many of them are deeply persuaded that the best works they've ever done is yesterday. That's, of course, that's normal because, that's evolution. And sometimes that's the job of curator to say, whoa, come, don't,
right.
Relax. you can show more, the rest is good too, you know what I mean? And I think also there are other reasons. He was working with the Galerie de France, with which he had a very, you have to imagine that Hartung was one of the most expensive artists, at the time on the world. He was one of the most acknowledged, and he was in position of force against his powerful gallery anyway. And they had a very big contract. They were in economic difficulties. There was the crash of 1974. It was complex. So he had basically to sell. They had to sell the works. I think there was kind of a strange mixture. I'm speaking here under the control of the foundation, but I think it might have been one of the elements, but I'm pretty sure that he just wanted to show the last 4 years of his already pretty long career, and never forget too that he was attacked by one critic, and one critic only, but very prominent and very early. So it was a deadly bite. And 2 weeks after that, all the other articles didn't save the thing. But it's interesting. I mean, like every great artist in art history knows this kind of, difficult moment. But we are all lucky that history of art usually cool things down and say this is a moment, explain things. But yeah.
Well, it seems like such an unusual thing for the Met to do, too, to have a contemporary artist, that way. Not only because it's just the late work, but just to have a contemporary artist.
Of course.
That seems to be a more modern thing that they're doing.
Of course, yeah. That was strange. The whole thing was strange. Yeah. But so that's pretty interesting because after that, there have been several exhibitions, like a lot, but not on the same, check, it was kind of underrated from then. So it's been not 40 years that it's been complex, but that's a lot. I mean, it's hard to say he disappeared, far from it. And something important too, he was pretty clever, and with his wife, Eva Bergman, when they died, and before they died, they thought about conceiving a foundation. They didn't have any children.
Right.
So their main children was their work, common work. And there was the foundation in the south of France. And so basically they put all their energy to store things for scholars. I mean, when I went there, I was among many people from many museums coming here to study the works and being hosted. Actually, it was a wonderful tool to show what it is about, whether you like it or not. It's there. It's amazing. So that's another chance. They kind of and that's very important actually, because you can still see the work. He preserved lots of works that you can see here. I mean, the main part of the loans come from the foundation. You have the MoMA, of course, you have the Albright Knox, but the main loans from the foundations, because Hartung wanted the works, to stay in the same place, to be conserved correctly. All the works here look like fantastic. You have to know that he was working with restorers, like the best of the time, with the people working at the Louvre, to have the best varnishes, to have the best paintings, to have the best canvas, the best stretchers. And to be honest, he had the money to, but I know many artists making a lot of money who buy just cheap canvases and cheapest
and they were complex
varnish.
materials, because he he mixed them up, right?
He mixed them up, of course, but always mastered, actually.
Yeah.
And he has very precise recipe for everything, for every color, every fluidity, because fluidity is so important. His work, everything is always liquid somehow.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reason his fascination for the liquid elements or even aerial elements, clouds, is that they are not built. His logic, very rational logic, was sometimes compared to maybe not conceptual art, but at least geometric art, geometric abstraction, or constructivist art. But it never builds this way. There is never right angles. There is never straight lines. It's never parallel to the canvas. It's always, moving by
upward.
Moving upward.
Surging up.
Unstable. And I remember I was initially like a scholar on kineticism, perceptual art, like basically instability. I was really, it was really strong to me, this kind of permanent movement. And he was in any exhibition on the movement. He wasn't a kinetic artist, he wasn't a perceptual artist. It doesn't make that much sense to put it, I don't know, with James Turrell or, I don't know, Julio de Parc. It doesn't make sense. But he had, all the paintings are instability that is conceptually and physically contained by the canvas.
Yeah.
The trace, the action, and at the same time, when you look at it, you feel it. You see?
We didn't talk about it, just occurred to me, that kind of sculptural component. And he did sculpt, and a little.
He did one sculpture, but it is interesting, actually, in 1938, with Julio González, actually.
Right.
It's a nice thing, actually, because it's about drawing into space as well.
Yeah.
There are mostly lines and planes that are curved.
I didn't realize that was the only one.
Yeah, no.
Because kind of one thinks of this sort of in some of the paintings, and the balance between the gesture and the sculptural quality. Oh.
The idea of the trace is important too, actually. And what I've liked particularly, not to oppose, your intuition, but his paintings are, when you go around, for example, here in the exhibition, but in general, are amazingly flat. It's almost, images. When you compare to other artists, whether they are European or American, you can see a lot of matter. You can see a lot of thickness because there is a lot of oil, there is a lot of acrylic, like you can see the brush strokes. It's kind of relief. When you look closer, on the border of the paintings, you can see a lot of relief. When you look at Hartung, it's amazingly flat. He was really working on really flat layers. The complexity of his work comes from the superimposed and interlaced layers of paintings that are basically communicating one with the other. He regularly spoke about not superimposed grids, but about, I don't know the name in English, glacis. It's a very classical, nobody knows the name in English, I'm sorry.
Varnish.
Yeah, it's more complex than varnish, actually. It's basically glaze. Glazing, yeah. So basically, he was very, he looked very close to, I don't know, Greco, Rembrandt, to understand, the layers, even Da Vinci, just to understand the superimposed layers of glaze, to, to capture the light, and also the eye, actually, to make the painting look real. But even on that, actually, he was deeply persuaded that the superimposed grids that you can see in the early works around 1950 that are in the first rooms could be replaced with more complex structures, mostly sprayed colors. And the multiple dots, tiny dots, were for him much more convincing and much less obvious than the dots that are done one by one with a brush that you can find in neo-impressionist paintings, pointillist paintings. Think about Seurat. He was like, yeah, those guys are just making optical illusion. It's artificial, it doesn't work. The layers of sprayed painting of millions of droplets do the same effect of transparencies between the several layers. So yeah, there is the drawing, there is the design, there are the lines interlaced, you see, and there is the those basically I don't know, see-through layers logic actually that is very strong. So it's always about the depth of the plane. I remember reading Harold Rosenberg in 1952 speaking about, I remember the French expression but not the English one, which is very bad. I'm so sorry about that. But basically I would retranslate it in English as thin space. Espace maigre, meager space, like a space represented, an artistic space, aesthetic space, which is not depth, which is not perspective, and which is not flat, something in between. And Rosenberg was speaking basically about the interlaced grids of the final paintings by Mondrian, you know, especially the New York series, where the superimposed grids are not that superimposed, they are interlaced, creating a space that is pretty ambiguous, which is not depth and not flatness. Yeah. And he was speaking, of course, of Mondrian to explain the drippings of Pollock and how there were basically fish in nets, and the fish was the eyeball of the spectator that was trapped in between trapped in this this grid, actually, these grids, interlaced grids.
Holding it together.
Yeah, yeah. It makes something very interesting about the notion of, very well-known notion of the modernist grid that Rosalind Krauss spoke extensively about. Having this kind of, like, basically, I don't know, surfaces, not structures, right, but surfaces. I mean, clouds, flat clouds that are basically allowing you to see other clouds and other backgrounds. That's very crucial. But I don't want to be too precise, actually, but too like specific. But I think that's an interesting way to understand his work now. But maybe you told a few things about the way he was a precursor, and at the same time he was hard to compare with previous artists. He did his own language. Every decade he was kind of transforming his own practice and having a huge influence. I remember when I discovered the work in the south of France at his former studio, it was striking. I was seeing, I don't know, Wade Guyton for, the Epson series, just in the back here. I was like, because he painted with big rolls that were used for prints. I mean, like a printer, prints. I mean, it's the same, but he was holding it by hand. Of course, this is not the same thing. When I saw the very colored works on the other wall over there, I thought about, sorry, we talked about them. Sorry, I have a memory.
Sam Francis?
Oh, no, yeah, of course, Sam Francis, but very contemporary. And Wolfgang Tillmans, his abstract, cameraless series is striking. I've told you that, but I've been showing as a test to friends knowledgeable in art, did you see that? They say, oh, that's a nice Tillmans. And I was saying, no, you don't, it's not. It's a painting that is more than 40 years old by Hans Hartung. Hans who? So many, think about Katharina Gross, think about, there's so many actually painters. Christopher Wool is the biggest fan on earth of Hans Hartung.
Is he?
Yeah, he's been spending extensive time at the foundation, going through the archives and the paintings and speaking with our friend Jean-Luc and Bernard. I mean, that's incredible, and I think that's the best way to see if an artist is historical or not. You see his influence actually, and not only his you know, friends, Mark Rothko, or his Abex, you know, colleagues, so sort of.
No, this is, I mean, he really, we think of him with a kind of limited style when we have a vision of him and the work he does. And with me, it's usually these striated things where he cut into the, you know, and that's sort of the sort of signature thing that you think about. And yet, really, he partook of all kinds of abstraction, and you know, alluded to, you know, obviously all those artists, and you would think this looks so much like so and so, and this looks so much like so and so, and then, but carrying it forward is the curious thing, and I don't think that most of these artists are taking from him so much as I think it's more a coincidence.
Of course,
that there's. I mean, I may be wrong.
No, but you know about influence, you know, sometimes it's direct.
Yeah.
So I remember one of the main influence of Jesus Rafael Soto was White Square, White on White Square by Malevich, 1915, because he saw a reproduction in white, in black and white, like let's say in gray, you know, few shades of gray, in the from the late 40s. He discovered that in 1950, and he was really influenced by this tiny image, you know, in this manual of history of art, and also the name. And you basically couldn't even see the, you know, the first square within the square. Right. I mean, it was. He told me that I had the chance to speak with Soto, and he told me too that he was really disappointed when he went to New York in 1965 to see the real painting at the MoMA. It looked. Yeah, trivial, like painterly, not.
Yeah,
I mean, what he imagined was magical. So, you know, just to say that influence is not always through, you know, having been the assistant of, not having been an extensive scholar on an artist, and then, but sometimes just seeing an image here or there. It can be very influenced.
It's subliminal sometimes.
Yeah, subliminal.
It's not intentional. I mean, you know, the best kind of influences come to you.
But sometimes you can, another interesting art history, and I close this part, but I remember Eric de Chassé, which is an art historian, specialist of Abex. He's a French scholar, but he's been studying extensively here, mostly on the influence of Matisse on American Abex. And he told me once that for years, Ellsworth Kelly, who went to France actually with his you know, military grant actually, he could go wherever he wanted, and as many artists, they went to Paris, which was the place to be at the time. And in 1959, you find hard edge paintings in his works, in Kelly's works, 51, sorry. And everybody say, oh, you must have seen Matisse cut papers like papier découpé, like with hard edge. And you say, yeah, but later on in 58, 59, yeah, sure, but I did the same thing at the same moment. But in fact, yes, there are many common points, but later on. And he pretended that like for decades. And Eric de Chassé was looking through his archive, didn't find anything to contradict. And then he looked into Alain Naudet's archives, and they were, I think, in Australia. It was his former boyfriend. And he found two letters by Kelly saying to Naudet, you have to come to Paris, see the papier découpé, and we were in 1951. So it's always, you know, you have to listen to artists, and at the same time, you better temper what they say, you know. So, no, it's all just to close that episode. It's always about the game of influence, of course. It's complex, actually, and sometimes you do something without copying it, just because it's in the air, you know, because you look at the same sources, sometimes decades after that, and you find it's like taking the same elements and making
Yes.
the same recipe, but by chance. But you've taken the same elements, the same, you know, vegetable, meat, whatever.
Do you know who falls into that category? Henri Michaud. That he's sort of behind everything. I don't think people even realize it. And you always go through a show and you say, that looks like Henri Michaud. And yet it's not intentional. It wasn't intentional, I mean, maybe, but he was sort of an abiding influence.
Yeah. No, he's been looked a lot at Michaud at the time. If next time I do an exhibition on Abex or something, I sure have Henri Michaud in the same position as, I don't know, Pollock, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whether this is not the same, you know, big canvases,
right.
This is not the same ambition. He was mostly a poet, he was a writer. I named my own son after Henri because of Henri Michaud. I'm a huge fan.
Really?
Yeah. And this, you could think about Henri Matisse too, but something else. No, but Michaud, just to come back to Michaud.
Excuse me.
Don't worry. So Michaud is very important as well. Like, I think Michaud was more into the kind of greed logic. You don't see that much greed, like all over logic. Michaud is closer to Pollock than it is from Hartung, in a way, because when you look at every painting by Hartung, there is no all over. That's one of the main differences with Pollock, for example. He's not covering the whole thing, you know. He is always, you know, attracted by the main move, the main central motion, actually. There's kind of immaterial figure that is there. It could be, you know, compared to a cloud, to a storm, to a light bolt, to a volcano, of course, to a tree, you know, name it. But it's kind of not subject orientated.
Yeah.
But he's not into the, you know, the greed totally. Even if, you know, obviously some motives go out of the canvas. When you visit the foundation, the main place where he was painting is still in the state it was when he died, and you have paintings all over the walls, mostly because the last years he was using these pump.
The spray thing?
Yeah, but the things that you use for a hose for, you know, putting some
the
gardener thing, you know, and it was going everywhere. So all the words are here. So it wasn't that subject centered on the no, it was spreading around, of course. And funny thing too, he was keeping at the time the leftovers. So the papers on the floor, even some wood panels on the wall that he's been storing actually. So when you go to the studio, you have one configuration of the studio at a given moment, but you could have, just by reinstalling other panels, another configuration. I told you, he was keeping everything. But which is great for posterity, actually. Definitely. I don't know how I went on this. I digressed quite a lot.
That's interesting. What do you mean try?
Thank you.
This is sort of like Pollock. Didn't Pollock? Well, it's left, but I don't know.
Yeah, but let's say like the guy who basically was anterior to Pollock went further than Pollock when he was 85 on his wheelchair with garden tools. And at the time, he basically couldn't move his body, actually. He couldn't even get in a swimming pool by himself. He was really diminished, and he kind of makes his first, instincts.
Yeah.
Invented some really, vertical drippings in around 1938. That's why I showed this little work on black and white. When you can see the drops of matter like exploding like that. This is pure dripping. Many years after Pollock, we always think about André Masson dripping some sand on the paintings, but let's mention Hartung too right now. I think we can. It's authorized. History of art is more globalized today, let's say. hoping is more globalized. So I don't know. Maybe you guys have some questions. We are, you know, small committee, so like.
I would like to ask you. It may have been in many American institutions,
Yes.
but why is almost non-existent into the art world in New York? And I would like to say that my experience from France was that when I reached the age of 20, let's say Hartung was too old for me and too established, so I could not have a mentor or connect. And that's one of the main reasons why I came to the United States, because I could connect with the artists from Soho in the 70s and 80s. But one of the rare artists with whom I had a conversation on French painter like Hartung or Unruhe was with Bryce Marden. Bryce used to spend some time in Paris. He went to some gallery, he knew those work, but most art critics here would not know the work of those French painters, and mostly they have been really very absent in the New York art scene. Would you have an explication for that? Why they are so? Why the reception, the perception of those artists like Hartung or Unruhe is not existent here?
I don't know. Do you think it's sort of like old clothes or something? That, you know, old, well-made clothes and things, but they've moved beyond it. I don't think it was because there was a suspicion of French artists or anything else. I don't think it was an anti-French thing so much. I think it's more a kind of, if I can say it, it's like provincialism too. You know, always looking for the newest New York thing and, you know, the flashiest thing. I mean, I think that was a problem with probably with the Hartung's show at the Met, they were trying to model it on what would be popular and flashy at the moment. And it didn't work. But I don't think, you know, there really aren't answers to these questions. You know, I mean, sometimes there are, but I don't think, I mean, why those things aren't, I mean, that's work that's very much about writing and very gestural in many ways, and that was just probably, for the moment, not, I don't know why they're not being well received now, except that another thing that might have something to do with it are the big galleries in Chelsea. How do you fill the walls? You can't do it with little things. So, you know. But
the good thing with Hartung is that they basically had any receptions in here for a long time. I mean, at least it's a clear way. That's a good thing. But I think there wasn't anything against, you know, France in particular, but maybe not against Europe, but like kind of, you know, maybe an American belief of there is the old continent and we have to think something new that is ours. That's obviously a reasonable, you know, cause to that. And I mean, World War II has basically like hurted the continent badly, actually. Just as look at Hartung's biography, you know, that there was the less energy, actually. Even today, I don't know, the New York State seems a bit weakened compared to the strengths of, I don't know, China. You know, everyone traveling a bit in China sees the amazing energy, money, strength, and, you know, ferocity that make the American market like look, you know, a bit pretty calm. So, I mean, that's a macroeconomic reason, maybe one of the maybe many reasons. Please.
Actually, bringing up the Lefebvre Gallery is a case in point, because John Lefebvre basically was a kind of European outpost in New York.
Right.
And he made a very strong point. He was an incredible salesman. That made him a successful dealer. But the fact is, he felt himself to be the representer of European art at the time. And he was successful, but it was an almost feudal gesture, because he was in a context that was dead set against it, basically. New York was going in a different direction. I think it's an important point to bring in.
But one thing is that, what about all the Americans, probably later, all the American artists who went to Paris, like Shirley Jaffe, Norman Bloom, Joe Mitchell, a whole group of them all went to Paris. And it probably was later than Hartung. About the same, a little bit later, but
20 years,
very much that were leaving the States.
Of course.
In Milton residence,
of course,
the whole group in Paris were living there. And they still felt that was, you know, I mean, where Joan Mitchell lived, she lived outside of Paris near Giverny.
Yeah,
you know,
with Jean-Paul.
But what did they bring back from that,
yes,
do we
then,
think?
So
What was
how
that?
many came back? And of course, Joan Mitchell and Shirley Jaffe did not come back.
No, she stayed.
Years and years. Yeah. And so they were very attuned to wanting to be there.
Yeah, of course.
You know,
No,
so
of
there
course.
was a real connection, and I think that,
I mean, Europe didn't lose all its interest, you know, all of a sudden, of course, thanks God. But when you look closer, I mean, the dialogue is definitely more complex than it looks, and it should be hard, as you said, to answer the question and to explain Hartung reception only through this, filter. That's for sure. But you talk about very important artists that went just 20 years after. That's why I say he's the missing link. Basically from the generation that in Europe was precocious, and from a slightly different generation. Let's say again between Kandinsky and Shirley or Jeff, or you see, just in between. So, but it's hard to explain. History of reception is like, you know, alchemy. You know, it's always complex. You can put the fact all together, and sometimes it doesn't make more sense. So you have to be quite humble against it. Maybe other questions? I mean, so what I can do is thank you very much for your attention, and
Thank you.
hope you enjoyed the show.